Close your eyes and imagine the year is 1325. Outside the stone walls of the castle, peasants huddled together in straw-roofed cottages, their fires weak, their bellies often half empty. But inside the towering keep, life is different. So different it almost feels like another world. Behind iron-banded doors and tapestries that block the winter drafts, the life of a medieval millionaire unfolds in ways that few in history ever witnessed. This was a world of privilege, secrecy, and endless power. To be wealthy in the Middle Ages was not simply to have gold coins jingling in your purse. It meant controlling land that stretched farther than the eye could see. Villages where entire populations bent their backs for your gain, and trade routes that carried exotic spices, silks, and jewels to your private halls. The difference between the barefoot farmer and the landowning elite was so vast it might as well have been two different species of human. And yet, the millionaire of medieval times did not live in effortless bliss. His, or in rarer cases her, life was shaped by intrigue, danger, and responsibility. To hold wealth in this world was to hold a double-edged sword. At any moment, jealous rivals might conspire to take it. Kings could demand it, and fate, through plague or rebellion, might strip it all away in a single season. But for those fortunate enough to keep their place at the top, their daily life shimmered with luxuries unimaginable to the common eye. Velvet curtains lined their private chambers. Their meals were seasoned with cinnamon and saffron, spices more valuable than gold. Skilled falconers brought hawks to their fists as they rode across frozen fields. Servants bathed them in perfumed water, while outside the castle walls, entire villages went years without the luxury of a proper wash. So tonight, as you listen, we're going to step inside the life of one such medieval millionaire. You'll walk through the heavy oaken gates into his castle. You'll dine at his feasts, sleep in his chamber, whisper with his wife, command his servants, and sit beside him as he balances accounts that measure not in coins, but in kingdoms.
This isn't the story you were told in school, the neat outline of lords and vassals. This is the hidden, private story, one that reveals how the richest men and women of the Middle Ages lived, how they loved, what they feared, and what they clung to in the coldest, darkest nights of history. Before we begin this journey deeper into the secret halls of medieval wealth, take a moment to support the channel. If you're enjoying this immersive dive into history, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this video. And I'd love to know where in the world and in what year you're listening from. Drop it in the comments below. It helps bring this community together across both time and space. Now, let's step into the stone corridors of wealth and privilege. The story begins not in battlefields or market stalls, but in something much more intimate. The childhood of a medieval millionaire, where the seeds of fortune and destiny were first sown. Childhood of wealth, born into gold and land. To be born into wealth in the Middle Ages was to enter life with privileges that the majority of humanity could only dream about. Imagine the moment of birth. While peasant mothers labored in smoky huts with only neighbors or midwives to assist, the wife of a wealthy noble or merchant often gave birth in a chamber lined with tapestries, candles burning to keep the shadows away, and a team of attendants on hand. The newborn's first cries echoed not through a drafty cottage, but through stone walls hung with embroidered cloth meant to keep the cold out and the prestige in. From the very beginning, a millionaire's child was surrounded by symbols of power. Cradles were carved from oak or walnut,
sometimes decorated with intricate designs of saints or family crests. Nurses and wet nurses were hired to feed and care for the infant. These women were carefully chosen not only for their health, but for their loyalty. For even in infancy, the child represented the future of dynasties, estates, and fortunes. Education began earlier than one might expect. While a peasant child's first lessons came from watching their parents tend fields, a wealthy child learned from books, scrolls, or hired tutors. Boys destined to inherit estates were taught Latin so they could read charters and legal texts. They learned to calculate rents, measure land, and write in elegant script. They were trained in horsemanship almost as soon as they could walk, for a millionaire's son was expected to command men on horseback one day. Girls were not neglected, though their education was different. They were taught the arts of embroidery, household management, and sometimes even music or poetry. A noble daughter represented more than beauty or charm. She was a tool of alliance. Through marriage, her hand could bind families, lands, and even entire counties together. From an early age, she was groomed to carry the honor and reputation of her family into another household. The toys of wealthy children reveal much about their world. While peasant children might fashion dolls from rags or carve whistles from wood, a millionaire's child played with miniature knights of silver or ivory, hobby horses with painted details, and dolls dressed in fine linen. These weren't merely amusements. They were lessons, preparing the young to understand their role in the hierarchy of medieval society.
Meals for such children were rich compared to their peasant counterparts. Porridge was sweetened with honey. Bread was made from finely sifted wheat flour rather than coarse rye. And milk was warmed and spiced with cinnamon if the household could afford it. Even in childhood, they tasted flavors that common villagers might never encounter in their entire lives. But wealth did not shield them from fear. Medieval childhood was fragile, and even the richest children faced the ever-present shadow of disease. Smallpox, measles, or the flux could sweep through the halls of a castle as easily as a village hut. Noble families mourned just as peasants did, though with more ritual, more candles, and more stone carved in memory. A child who survived past the dangerous years of early life carried the weight of enormous expectation. Expectation to inherit, to govern, to continue the wealth of the family into the uncertain future. And behind the privilege, there was always discipline. A wealthy boy was not coddled for long. At 7, he might be sent to another noble household as a page, where he would learn humility, obedience, and the first steps toward knighthood. A girl, at a similar age, might be promised in marriage, her childhood becoming a careful training in how to manage estates, servants, and future children of her own. For the medieval millionaire, childhood was both gilded and heavy with destiny. Every toy, every lesson, every feast, and every prayer was a preparation. To grow up wealthy in the Middle Ages was to live surrounded by abundance, but also by invisible chains of responsibility. From the cradle, one's life was not one's own, but part of a dynasty, a family name that reached beyond the self into land, power, and legacy.
And as this child grew into youth, the stone walls of their home revealed more than protection. They revealed the heart of their identity. For the home of a medieval millionaire was not merely a dwelling, it was a castle, a fortress, and a stage where wealth and power were displayed for the world to see. Childhood of wealth,
born into gold and land. To be born into wealth in the Middle Ages was to enter life with privileges that the majority of humanity could only dream about. Imagine the moment of birth, while peasant mothers labored in smoky huts with only neighbors or midwives to assist. The wife of a wealthy noble or merchant often gave birth in a chamber lined with tapestries, candles burning to keep the shadows away, and a team of attendants on hand. The newborn's first cries echoed not through drafty cottages, but through stone walls, hung with embroidered cloth meant to keep the cold out and the prestige in. From the very beginning, a millionaire's child was surrounded by symbols of power. Cradles were carved from oak or walnut, sometimes decorated with intricate designs of saints or family crests. Nurses and wet nurses were hired to feed and care for the infant. These women were carefully chosen not only for their health, but for their loyalty. For even in infancy, the child represented the future of dynasties, estates, and fortunes.
Education began earlier than one might expect. While a peasant child's first lessons came from watching their parents tend fields, a wealthy child learned from books, scrolls, or hired tutors. Boys destined to inherit estates were taught Latin so they could read charters and legal texts. They learned to calculate rents, measure land, and write in elegant script. They were trained in horsemanship almost as soon as they could walk, for a millionaire's son was expected to command men on horseback one day. Girls were not neglected, though their education was different. They were taught the arts of embroidery, household management, and sometimes even music or poetry. A noble daughter represented more than beauty or charm. She was a tool of alliance. Through marriage, her hand could bind families, lands, and even entire counties together. From an early age, she was groomed to carry the honor and reputation of her family into another household. The toys of wealthy children reveal much about their world. While peasant children might fashion dolls from rags or carve whistles from wood, a millionaire's child played with miniature knights of silver or ivory, hobby horses with painted details, and dolls dressed in fine linen. These weren't merely amusements, they were lessons, preparing the young to understand their role in the hierarchy of medieval society. Meals for such children were rich compared to their peasant counterparts. Porridge was sweetened with honey. Bread was made from finely sifted wheat flour rather than coarse rye, and milk was warmed and spiced with cinnamon if the household could afford it. Even in childhood, they tasted flavors that common villagers might never encounter in their entire lives. But wealth did not shield them from fear. Medieval childhood was fragile, and even the richest children faced the ever-present shadow of disease. Smallpox, measles, or the flux could sweep through the halls of a castle as easily as a village hut. Noble families mourned just as peasants did, though with more ritual, more candles, and more stone carved in memory. A child who survived past the dangerous years of early life carried the weight of enormous expectation. Expectation to inherit, to govern, to continue the wealth of the family into the uncertain future.
And behind the privilege, there was always discipline. A wealthy boy was not coddled for long. At 7, he might be sent to another noble household as a page, where he would learn humility, obedience, and the first steps toward knighthood. A girl at a similar age might be promised in marriage, her childhood becoming a careful training in how to manage estates, servants, and future children of her own. For the medieval millionaire, childhood was both gilded and heavy with destiny. Every toy, every lesson, every feast, and every prayer was a preparation. To grow up wealthy in the Middle Ages was to live surrounded by abundance, but also by invisible chains of responsibility. From the cradle, one's life was not one's own, but part of a dynasty, a family name that reached beyond the self into land, power, and legacy. And as this child grew into youth, the stone walls of their home revealed more than protection. They revealed the heart of their identity. For the home of a medieval millionaire was not merely a dwelling. It was a castle, a fortress, and a stage where wealth and power were displayed for the world to see. Servants and the machinery of wealth. No millionaire lived alone. His fortune was embodied in the people who served him. From dawn until long past dusk, dozens of men and women moved silently through his halls. Each had a specific role, each tied to the delicate balance of power within the household. At the bottom were the kitchen boys, whose hands were perpetually raw from scalding water, ash, and grease. Above them stood the cooks, entrusted with transforming imported spices and expensive meats into feasts that impressed noble guests. Stable hands tended the millionaires' prized horses, their stalls cleaner than most peasants' homes. The household steward, however, wielded immense authority. He kept the keys to storerooms, signed off on purchases, and tracked which servants performed well or slacked. To fall from his favor was to risk banishment back into poverty. To rise within his gaze was to find small privileges, better food, warmer clothes, perhaps even the rare chance to travel with the master. Yet even in this hierarchy, danger lurked. A servant who knew too much could ruin reputations. An ambitious maid who carried whispers from one household to another could spark scandals. Trust was a fragile currency, as valuable as gold. The language of luxury. To be wealthy was to speak in symbols. Every item in the millionaire's house announced his status. Velvet cushions dyed in deep crimson, a color forbidden to commoners, adorned benches. A single silver goblet engraved with family crests could purchase a farmer's entire herd. Candles, which peasants lit only for Mass, burned nightly in great clusters, filling rooms with soft gold light. Even the walls spoke. Frescoes and painted panels depicted not saints, but scenes of hunting, myth, and lineage, reminders of both earthly pleasures and the unbroken chain of power. On feast days, the dining table itself became a stage. Platters carried roasted swans dressed in their own feathers, gilded pies with live birds that burst out when cut, and sugared sculptures shaped like castles. Each dish proclaimed, "Here is a man whose wealth defies ordinary limits."
Fear in the shadows. But with wealth came constant fear. Envy bred enemies, and riches drew thieves. At night, the millionaire's gates were bolted, guards patrolled the walls, and dogs prowled the courtyard. Even so, he sometimes lay awake in his chamber, listening to the creak of timber and the whisper of wind against shutters, wondering if a rival might strike. Poison was a common terror. Trusted tasters sampled wine before he drank. Physicians, often more skilled in astrology than medicine, prescribed charms and herbs against sudden illness. Some millionaires commissioned elaborate lockboxes for food, guarded even within their own kitchens. Beyond physical threats lay spiritual ones. Did his fortune tempt the wrath of God? Did the prayers he purchased outweigh the sins of his ambition? Each indulgence, each night of revelry, each bribe, each betrayal whispered to him in the dark. The mistress
and the hidden chamber. Though married for alliance, the millionaire often kept a mistress. Sometimes she was a courtesan, educated and witty, able to entertain guests in secret salons. Sometimes she was a maid or companion elevated from the household, her beauty becoming another ornament of wealth. These affairs were hidden behind thick curtains, walled gardens, or even secret chambers within the house. Such liaisons could be dangerous. If discovered, they risked scandal, bastard heirs, or even blackmail. Yet they persisted, for they embodied both power and escape. To step into such a chamber was to glimpse the raw, unvarnished side of medieval wealth. There, away from the gaze of church and society, the millionaire revealed his truest self, not just a man of riches, but a creature of flesh, longing and fear. Wealth as a political weapon. In the Middle Ages, politics was not defined by parliaments or votes, but by relationships, alliances of families, lords, and kings. For a millionaire, his gold and land were his voice, and every coin spent could tip the balance of power. Bribes were common, though cloaked in ceremony. A gift of horses to a noble, a loan of silver to a bishop, or a lavish feast for a royal court, all were tools of influence. The millionaire's ability to spend without blinking often opened doors closed to lesser men. More than gifts, however, were marriages. The millionaire's children were pawns in an endless game of strategy. A daughter married into a rising knightly family could secure soldiers in times of war. A son wed to the daughter of a wealthy guildmaster could expand trade and fortune. These unions were rarely about love. They were business deals written in flesh, inked in dowries, sealed in vows before God. The shadow of war. Wealth also meant responsibility for defense. In a society where kings often demanded military support, millionaires were expected to provide men at arms. Their estates became recruitment centers, their stables filled with armored horses, their smithies ringing with the sound of iron forged into weapons.
Sometimes the millionaire himself rode to battle, gleaming in mail or plate, carrying a banner emblazoned with his coat of arms. At other times, he stayed behind, sending hired knights in his stead. Either way, his fortune determined the scale of his contribution. But war was not just duty, it was opportunity. Victorious campaigns brought plunder, land, and ransom. A wealthy man could grow richer through conquest, though just as easily, a single defeat could swallow his fortune whole. Rivalries and betrayals. No millionaire existed in peace for long. The same fortune that bought him allies also made him a target. Rivals plotted to undermine him, whispering slanders in courts and monasteries. A failed alliance, an unpaid debt, or a broken promise could ignite vendettas lasting generations. Some millionaires fell not by sword, but by ink. A forged letter, a treacherous clerk, or a false confession could bring ruin. Others were undone by their own ambition, overreaching in their hunger for power until kings themselves saw them as threats. Thus, the millionaire lived in constant vigilance. To protect his wealth, he paid spies, nurtured informants, and sometimes struck first, ruining others before they could strike at him.
Yet even as he moved in shadows, he wrapped himself in the mantle of religion. Churches he funded, monasteries he endowed, and alms he gave to the poor all broadcast a public image of holiness. Monks prayed for his soul. Priests preached of his generosity. Behind closed doors, however, he knew the truth. Wealth was both blessing and sin. Every coin he gave to the church was also a bribe to heaven, a purchase of forgiveness for indulgences committed in secrecy. And so every day the millionaire balanced on a knife's edge, his fortune a shield, a weapon, and a curse. Feasts of excess. When a millionaire entertained, his household became a theater of abundance. Long trestle tables groaned under roasted boars with apples clamped in their jaws, platters of spiced venison, sugared almonds imported from the East, and pies so large that live birds were sometimes hidden inside to flutter out at the moment of serving. The kitchen, a roaring heart of fire and smoke, worked for days in advance. Cooks stirred cauldrons, turned spits heavy with meat, and ground exotic spices, pepper, cinnamon, saffron, that cost more than silver by weight. Bread not of the coarse rye eaten by peasants, but fine white loaves gleamed like polished ivory on the tables. Wine from France, ale from local brewers, and mead flavored with honey flowed without end. Guests left with stained lips and blurred vision, their laughter echoing through the manor until dawn.
Music, dance, and spectacle. Banquets were not only about eating, they were performances of wealth. Troubadours sang of knightly love, minstrels strummed harps and lutes, and jugglers hurled knives toward the ceiling beams. Dancers, sometimes professional entertainers, sometimes guests themselves, filled the floor, their movements lit by the warm flicker of torches. The millionaire sat enthroned at the head of the table, his every smile or frown shaping the mood of the room. Fire-eaters, trained bears, or acrobats might appear if the master wished to truly dazzle. Each display said the same thing. Here lives a man whose wealth can summon wonder. The inner chambers. Beyond the great hall lay a world unseen by the majority of guests, the inner chambers. Here, wealth turned from public performance to intimate indulgence. Beds were piled with feather mattresses and covered in silk sheets, imported at immense cost. Perfumes from Arabia, ambergris, and rosewater masked the smells of wood smoke and sweat. Candles made from costly beeswax glowed softly, unlike the smoky tallow used by peasants. Here, too, the millionaire entertained select companions, courtesans and favored mistresses, often adorned with jewelry gifted to them, whispered laughter behind closed doors. These encounters were not merely lust, they were politics, pleasure, and power woven together.
In quieter moments, the millionaire indulged in games. Dice clattered across wooden boards, fortunes rising and falling in the flick of a wrist. Chess, imported centuries earlier from the Islamic world, was played by candlelight, each carved piece a miniature symbol of war and strategy. But gambling was a danger as well as a delight. A single night's reckless play could cost a fortune, or worse, offend a rival whose honor was as fragile as glass. The contrast of two worlds. While peasants huddled in the cold, gnawing coarse bread by the dim light of a fire, the millionaire reclined in warmth, surrounded by music, food, and companionship. His life was a performance of contrasts, abundance against scarcity, indulgence against deprivation. And yet, every feast, every night of pleasure carried a shadow. He knew that his wealth was envied. His enemies whispered. His heirs grew impatient. His servants watched everything. Pleasure for him was never free of risk. Marriage as strategy. For the medieval millionaire, Marriage was rarely an affair of the heart. It was a calculated pact, a negotiation sealed not only between two individuals, but between entire families. His wife was often chosen for her dowry, land, livestock, coin, or connections that could expand his fortune and secure his status. Sometimes the bride was barely into her teenage years, married off by ambitious parents. At the wedding feast, vows were spoken before God, but behind the holy words lay contracts and bargains.
Still, within this practical arrangement, affection sometimes grew. A wife who bore sons, managed household servants, and represented her husband's dignity in public could become a trusted partner. Yet, if she failed to produce heirs, or worse, sons, whispers of replacement haunted her days. The household as a web. The millionaire's family life extended far beyond the wife. His household was a sprawling web of children, kin, servants, and retainers. In a world where survival was uncertain, large families were both shield and burden. Children were nurtured with care, for each carried the possibility of strengthening the family legacy. Sons were taught Latin, accounting, and swordsmanship if destined for knighthood. Daughters were schooled in piety, embroidery, and the subtle arts of charm, preparing them to be traded into alliances through marriage. Illegitimate children also existed, the silent evidence of private affairs or moments of indulgence. Some were quietly raised within the household, others given away to monasteries where they lived cloaked in prayers rather than privilege. Heirs and inheritance. The question of inheritance haunted every wealthy man. Land was the heart of medieval wealth, and land could not be divided endlessly. The eldest son usually inherited the bulk of estates, while younger sons often sought fortunes through the church, military service, or mercantile ventures. This system of primogeniture kept estates intact, but bred resentment. Younger sons, denied their father's wealth, sometimes turned to reckless pursuits, gambling, dueling, or scheming against their elder brother. In the wealthiest families, fratricity was not unknown.
Daughters, too, were part of the inheritance game. Their marriages were investments, their dowries carefully calculated to attract powerful allies. A daughter's union with a knight, a baron, or even a wealthy merchant could either elevate or weaken the family's fortunes for generations. The shadows of domestic life. Behind the public image of order and prosperity, the private home could also be a battleground. Jealousies simmered between legitimate and illegitimate heirs. Stepchildren vied for favor. Brothers plotted against one another. Wealth did not shield the millionaire's household from sickness either. Plague and fevers spared no family, rich or poor. A child who died young left both grief and political instability. An unexpected death of the heir could unravel decades of careful planning. Legacy and the burden of memory. Ultimately, the millionaire's greatest concern was not the feast of tonight, but the memory of tomorrow. Would his name endure? Would his children guard his wealth or squander it in folly? To secure his place in history, He commissioned manuscripts, founded chapels, and ordered stone effigies to be carved for his tomb. He wished his descendants to look upon his image and remember a man of wealth, power, and divine favor. But he knew, too, that a single war, a bad harvest, or a reckless heir could undo everything. Thus, even in the comfort of his private chambers, the millionaire never truly rested. His family was his pride, but also his most dangerous gamble. The great machine of service. A millionaire's household was more than family. It was an army of workers, from high-ranking stewards down to the humblest kitchen boys. Every corridor echoed with footsteps, every courtyard buzzed with labor. At the top stood the steward, the right-hand man who managed estates, collected rents, and oversaw the vast economic engine that kept the household fed and funded. Below him were bailiffs, reeves, and clerks, each ensuring that every coin and grain of wheat was accounted for. Closer to the private chambers, personal attendants tended to the millionaire's daily needs. Pages to fetch his boots, valets to dress him, barbers to shave him, and physicians to bleed him when illness struck.
Trust was fragile. Servants might be loyal for years, then betray their master for a bribe from a rival. Wealthy households were constantly at risk of infiltration. Spies disguised as cooks, scullions, or clerks, slipping secrets to competitors or enemies. Yet loyalty could also be fierce. Many servants served families for generations, their devotion as deep as kinship. Some even followed their masters into exile or war, dying beside them on foreign soil. The shadows of the kitchen and stable. Below the great hall, the kitchen was a furnace of ceaseless labor. Dozens of cooks, scullions, and spit boys worked in suffocating heat. Their lives were short, their backs bent, their hands scarred with burns. Yet through their toil came the extravagant feasts that dazzled guests. In the stables, grooms and stable-masters tended war horses worth more than many peasants' cottages. Each animal was brushed, shod, and fed with grain reserved only for beasts of war and nobility. A horse's failure in battle could doom a knight, but its care reflected the unseen work of these nameless men. Guards, watchmen, and shadows. Beyond the servants of comfort were those of defense. Guards patrolled the walls at night, torches flickering against stone battlements. Watchmen listened for whispers of unrest in town, reporting rumors before they became threats.
For the millionaire, danger lurked everywhere. Robbers on dark roads, rivals with daggers, even poison slipped into his wine. Loyal guards, therefore, were not more than protectors. They were lifelines. Yet betrayal among them was not uncommon. History is full of wealthy men who were slain by the very men paid to defend them. Slaves and the unfree. In some regions, particularly in earlier medieval centuries, unfree labor still existed. Captives from war or distant trade routes could be forced into households, stripped of freedom but bound by chains of obedience. Their silence and invisibility kept the millionaire's private indulgences hidden, though their suffering was the unspoken price of luxury. The household as a living creature. To outsiders, the millionaire's household seemed like a fortress of order, but inside it was a living, breathing organism of loyalty, rivalry, fear, and ambition. Servants carried secrets in every whisper. Guards weighed loyalty against greed. Spies moved like shadows through kitchens and stables. The millionaire's life of wealth, indulgence, and power was not a solitary triumph. It was sustained, exposed, and endangered by the very people who lived in his shadow.
The fragile web of fortune. Even the richest man in the medieval world lived on a knife's edge. One failed harvest, one betrayal by a steward, one unexpected raid by bandits could unravel decades of accumulated wealth. Money was never simply stored. It flowed through estates, markets, and trade routes, and each step brought risk. Lenders demanded interest that could cripple fortunes. Merchants could vanish with goods, and kings could seize lands on a whim. A millionaire might own vast tracts of land, but much of it was leased to tenants who sometimes resisted, stole, or rebelled. Wealth was power, but also vulnerability. Corruption within the household. Trust was both vital and dangerous. Stewards might embezzle, clerks could forge documents, and even close family members sometimes plotted to claim estates prematurely. Luxury invited envy. Rival nobles spread rumors, jealous merchants sabotaged shipments, and enemies in courts manipulated laws to seize property. A millionaire might own vast tracts of land, but much of it was leased to tenants who sometimes resisted, stole, or rebelled. Wealth was power, but also vulnerability.
Even a simple illness could drain a fortune. Physicians demanded fees, medications were costly, and treatment often required extended care that tied up servants and resources. A single epidemic could devastate wealth, leaving a millionaire's household scrambling for survival. Political entanglements. Money and power were inseparable. Every wealthy man had to navigate local politics, allegiances, and feudal obligations. Aligning with the wrong lord could result in fines, forced military service, or confiscation of lands. Peaceful neutrality was rarely possible. Ambition and envy ensured that every fortune became a target. Alliances required careful management. Gifts, favors, and marriages were tools to cement loyalty. Failure to maintain these connections could leave a millionaire isolated, vulnerable to rivals and rebellion. The weight of legacy. For medieval millionaires, wealth was not just about comfort, it was a legacy. Estates, jewelry, and titles had to be passed down carefully, and each generation presented new challenges. Inheritance disputes could split fortunes, and the slightest mismanagement could erase centuries of careful accumulation. Even the most secure fortune was a delicate balance between risk and reward, trust and suspicion. Every coin, every servant, every acre of land required constant attention, or the millionaire could find himself stripped bare. This chapter exposes how fortune in the medieval world was both a shield and a danger, showing that wealth was never purely a reward. It was a constant test of wisdom, vigilance, and resilience.
The glittering world of social life. A medieval millionaire's life was never solitary. Social interaction was both a necessity and a stage. Grand halls echoed with the clatter of goblets, the murmur of negotiation, and the laughter of carefully chosen company. Hosting lavish feasts wasn't merely indulgence, it was strategy. Exotic foods, imported wines, and carefully prepared dishes displayed wealth,
taste and sophistication. Every guest observed the subtle cues, the quality of tapestries, the elegance of silverware, the sophistication of entertainment. To impress the right people meant securing alliances, favor, and influence. Minstrels, jesters, and performers entertained, but behind the laughter and music, every movement was scrutinized. Eyes measured loyalty, ambition, and potential threats. Wealth attracted attention and envy.
Gambling, games, and intellectual pursuits. Not all indulgences were carnal. Wealth allowed the pursuit of intellectual and leisurely pleasures. Chess, dice, and strategy games sharpened the mind while offering social interaction and subtle competition. Collectors displayed manuscripts, illuminated books, maps, and instruments. These treasures reflected status and taste, but also offered strategic advantage. Knowledge of geography, politics, or military innovation could turn a fortune into influence. Discretion showcased wealth. Music, dancing, and theatrical performances were integrated into meals, creating an immersive spectacle. Music and arts. Many millionaires sponsored musicians, troubadours, and minstrels. Private performances in intimate chambers allowed for exclusive enjoyment of the arts. Patronage of painters, sculptors, and illuminated manuscript creators helped immortalize status. Games and recreation. Board games such as chess were popular, symbolizing strategy, intellect, and sophistication.
Hunting was both sport and social ritual. Owning trained hounds and hawks demonstrated prestige. Tournaments and jousts were not only public spectacles, but also personal leisure for the wealthy to participate or watch. Travel and exploration. Travel for leisure or pilgrimage allowed exposure to different cultures and fashions. Wealthy travelers often carried large entourages, signaling status to all encountered. Pilgrimages could serve both spiritual and social purposes, combining devotion with display of wealth. Libraries and learning. Wealthy households often maintained private libraries, rare manuscripts, and collections of classical texts. Reading and education were prestigious, and sponsoring scholarly works further enhanced social reputation. Intellectual salons allowed discussion and networking among the educated elite. Gardens and estates. Elaborate gardens were cultivated with exotic plants, fountains, and sculptures, providing a space for reflection and leisure. Estates included orchards, hunting grounds, and recreational areas designed for enjoyment and impressing guests. Even private spaces were carefully designed for both comfort and display of sophistication. Through these activities, medieval millionaires not only entertained themselves, but also reinforced their social dominance, signaling refinement, influence, and cultural leadership.
Daily routines and household management of a medieval millionaire. The life of a wealthy medieval individual was highly structured, with each day carefully orchestrated to balance comfort, status display, and efficiency. Managing a large household required planning, authority, and reliance on numerous staff. Morning rituals. Waking early, often at dawn, to greet the day with private prayers or reflection. Personal attendants helped with bathing, dressing in finely tailored garments, and grooming, which demonstrated both hygiene and status. Breakfasts were light but elegantly prepared,
sometimes featuring fresh bread, fruit, and spiced drinks. Household oversight. Wealthy individuals maintained a hierarchy of servants, including stewards, cooks, chambermaids, and gardeners. Daily management involved supervising staff, approving expenditures, and ensuring that the estate functioned smoothly. Meetings with key officers, such as the steward or bailiff, ensured the household and land holdings were well organized. Business and estate affairs. Much of the day was devoted to overseeing finances, rents, and trade operations. Correspondence with merchants, tax collectors, or distant family members required careful attention. Wealthy individuals were often involved in local politics or legal matters, leveraging influence to maintain their estates. Meals and socializing. Lunch was a formal affair, with household staff serving multiple courses. Guests were entertained with conversation, music, or storytelling, reinforcing social bonds and influence. Afternoon tea or light refreshments allowed for more informal interactions or relaxation. Afternoon activities. Hunting, falconry, or horseback riding were common leisure pursuits. Intellectual activities such as reading, writing, or studying classical texts provided stimulation and prestige. Crafting and commissioning artwork were not only hobbies, but also ways to demonstrate taste and refinement. Evening rituals. Dinners were grand social events, often attended by friends, neighbors, or visiting dignitaries. Entertainment could include musicians, jugglers, or acrobats performing within the hall. Nightly prayers or reflection closed the day, often followed by personal relaxation in private chambers. Wealthy individuals often inspected their estates personally, making decisions about improvements or expansions. Through these routines, a medieval millionaire not only ensured the smooth functioning of their household, but also projected authority, culture, and sophistication. Personal relationships, marriages, and family life of a medieval millionaire. Wealth in the medieval period extended far beyond material possessions. It was deeply tied to social connections, marriages, and family networks. For the wealthy, managing relationships was as much a strategic endeavor as it was a personal one. Marriage alliances. Marriages were often arranged to consolidate wealth, strengthen political ties, or expand influence. Dowries and marriage contracts were carefully negotiated, sometimes involving vast sums of money, land, or valuable goods. Love was often secondary to strategic advantage, though personal affection occasionally developed over time. Family structure. Households typically included the wealthy individual, spouse, children, and extended family, along with a large retinue of servants. Children were educated according to their gender and status. Sons in estate management, literacy, and martial skills. Daughters in household management, needlework, and etiquette. Inheritance was critical concern. Primogeniture, passing wealth to the eldest son, was common, though arrangements varied regionally. Social networking. Hosting feasts, banquets, and social gatherings reinforced status and maintained alliances. Visiting other noble households allowed for political maneuvering, exchanging favors, and showcasing one's wealth. Patronage of artists, clergy, and scholars both enhanced prestige and strengthened social ties.
Romantic relationships and courtship.
Extramarital affairs were not uncommon among the elite, though discretion was essential to avoid scandal. Courtly love, with its codes of chivalry and symbolic gestures, played a role in social culture, even if practical marriages were arranged. Letters, gifts, and commissioned artwork often expressed affection and reinforced bonds. Domestic life and intimacy. Private chambers were carefully maintained for comfort, privacy, and personal expression. Luxury items such as tapestries, scented oils, and fine linens enhanced the experience of daily life and personal relationships. Children, nurses, and tutors contributed to a household's domestic stability, allowing the wealthy to focus on public life and leisure. Conflict and resolution within the family. Disputes over inheritance, dowries, or property were common and could involve legal intervention. Maintaining loyalty and obedience among family members and servants was critical to avoid scandal or internal conflict. Mediation often involved respected advisors or relatives to ensure resolutions did not damage reputation or wealth. These personal dynamics demonstrate that medieval wealth was as much about human relationships and social influence as it was about tangible assets. The private lives of the rich were carefully curated, balancing public display with personal satisfaction. Leisure and entertainment of a medieval millionaire.
For a medieval millionaire, leisure was not simply relaxation. It was a statement of status, taste, and influence. The ways in which the wealthy spent their free time revealed much about social hierarchies and cultural priorities in the medieval era. Hunting and falconry. Hunting was both sport and training. It demonstrated skill, courage, and control over nature. Falconry was highly prized, with trained birds symbolizing prestige. Hunting trips often doubled as social events, where nobles and wealthy merchants showcased their wealth and formed alliances. Feasts and banquets. Elaborate feasts showcased culinary sophistication, with multiple courses, exotic spices, and theatrical presentations. Banquets were opportunities to display wealth, solidify alliances, and entertain guests with music, dancing, and performances. Table etiquette was complex. Who sat where reflected social hierarchy and political favor. Music and arts. Wealthy households often employed musicians, minstrels, and performers to provide entertainment. Patronage of artists, painters, and sculptors reinforced status and contributed to cultural development. Music lessons and participation in amateur performances were common for both men and women of the household. Games and pastimes.
Board games like chess were popular, symbolizing strategic thinking and intellectual refinement. Tournaments and jousts were both thrilling spectacles and opportunities for networking among the elite. Gambling and card games could be a pastime, though sometimes frowned upon depending on local norms. Travel and pilgrimages. Pilgrimages served religious devotion and could enhance social prestige. Travel allowed wealthy individuals to see distant lands, trade, and gain exposure to new ideas and technologies. Maintaining comfort and luxury while traveling required significant planning and retinues of servants. Reading and education. Wealthy households often had private libraries with manuscripts, religious texts, and literature. Literacy and knowledge of multiple languages were signs of refinement and influence. Education was a lifelong pursuit, with tutors and scholars often employed to teach children and adults. Private hobbies. Gardening, collecting rare objects, and studying alchemy or astrology were common intellectual pursuits. Needlework, embroidery, and textile arts were considered refined hobbies for women and sometimes men. Maintaining a private study or gallery for personal enjoyment was a mark of distinction. Through these activities, a medieval millionaire balanced personal pleasure, social display, and strategic influence. Leisure was never purely idle. It reinforced status, built alliances, and cultivated sophistication.
Daily routines and household management of a medieval millionaire. The life of a medieval millionaire was meticulously structured, blending comfort, control, and social obligation. Understanding their daily routines reveals not only the luxuries they enjoyed, but also the extensive organization required to maintain wealth and status. Morning rituals. Wealthy households often began the day with prayers or religious observances, reflecting the era's strong spiritual influence. Personal grooming was elaborate. Baths, where possible, hair care and clothing selection were carefully attended to by servants. Meals were light in the morning, often bread, cheese, and ale, while the main meal was saved for later in the day. Household staff and organization. Servants, stewards, cooks, and guards formed an extensive household hierarchy. Each member had specific duties. Stewards oversaw finances, cooks managed food preparation, and chambermaids ensured cleanliness. Households often included specialized personnel, like falconers, musicians, or tutors. Business and trade activities. Millionaires often engaged in managing estates, trade, or craft production. Meetings with agents or merchants were common, as was overseeing taxes, rents, and labor. Correspondence via letters was frequent, maintaining connections and negotiating deals across regions.
Afternoons might include recreational activities, games, hunting, or reading. Hosting or attending social gatherings reinforced alliances and status. Diplomacy and networking were embedded in daily routines, as wealth depended on influence as much as resources. Meals and culinary culture. Lunch, or the main meal, was a lavish affair with multiple courses and imported spices. Banquets followed strict etiquette. Placement at the table, choice of dishes, and conversation reflected social hierarchy. Guests were entertained with music, storytelling, or performances during meals. Evening and reflection. Evenings often involved private reflection, reading, or intellectual pursuits. Religious observance might resume with prayers or attending chapel services. Nightly routines included winding down, preparing clothes and spaces for the next day, and ensuring household security. Travel and estate visits. Journeys to estates, markets, or neighboring towns required careful planning. Travel was often luxurious, but demanded security. Armed escorts, guarded wagons, and arranged accommodations. Inspecting estates personally ensured productivity and loyalty among staff and tenants. Through these routines, medieval millionaires balanced luxury with practical management, ensuring their wealth was preserved and expanded. Their days reflected a mix of personal indulgence, religious duty, business acumen, and social responsibility.
Luxury possessions and wealth display in medieval times. For a medieval millionaire,
Wealth was not only about accumulating resources, it was about displaying status and influence through possessions, clothing, and architecture. How they showcased their riches offers insight into their private lives, tastes, and societal expectations. Jewelry and personal adornments. Precious metals, gemstones, and intricate designs were common, reflecting both wealth and craftsmanship. Rings, necklaces, and brooches were worn daily, often signaling family connections, alliances, or rank. Personal seals engraved with family crests or emblems were essential for authenticating documents and correspondence. Clothing and textiles. Fashion was a key indicator of status. Wealthy individuals wore layered garments of silk, velvet, and fur. Colors like deep reds, purples, and blues were expensive to produce and signified wealth. Embroidery and gold thread added both aesthetic appeal and social prestige. Housing and architecture. Mansions and manor houses were built to impress, with stone walls, grand halls, and intricate woodwork. Private chambers, libraries, and chapels reflected both comfort and cultural refinement. Gardens and courtyards served as spaces for leisure, meditation, and entertaining guests. Furniture and interior decor. Chairs, tables, and chests were often carved and decorated with heraldic symbols or intricate designs. Tapestries and wall hangings added warmth, artistic expression, and storytelling elements. Beds were large and ornate, often with canopies and luxurious fabrics to signify comfort and wealth. Weapons and status items.
Owning finely crafted swords, armor, and hunting equipment showcased power, not only utility. Falconry and hunting accessories were status symbols, demonstrating leisure and skill. Exotic imports like spices, glassware, and ceramics further distinguish the affluent from the common populace. Art, books, and cultural capital. Manuscripts, illuminated texts, and religious artifacts were prized possessions. Patronage of artists, musicians, and writers enhanced social prestige and cultural influence. Owning rare or imported items emphasized global connections and sophistication. Wealth as a social signal. Displaying wealth was intertwined with social expectation. Opulence conveyed power, taste, and influence. Guests, visitors, and rivals judged a medieval millionaire's success not merely by financial holdings, but by visible refinement. Luxury served both personal enjoyment and strategic social positioning. Through possessions, attire, and architecture, medieval millionaires transformed wealth into an expression of identity, ambition, and influence. Every item was chosen to convey status, impress others, and reinforce power.
Private entertainment, leisure, and indulgences. For a medieval millionaire, private life was not just about displaying wealth, it was about enjoying it. Leisure, hobbies, and indulgences defined daily routines and offered a window into personality, taste, and social strategy. Hunting and falconry. Hunting was both sport and social ritual. Wealthy landowners maintained hunting lodges stocked with hounds, falcons, and game. Falconry was especially prestigious, requiring skill, patience, and expensive birds of prey. Hunts offered networking opportunities, reinforcing alliances with other elites. Feasting and private banquets. Banquets were intimate affairs for friends, family, or select guests. Menus included multiple courses of meats, fish, exotic spices, and imported wine. Presentation mattered as much as taste. Elaborate serving vessels, sugar sculptures, and gilded plates displayed refinement. Music and entertainment. Musicians, minstrels, and singers provided private entertainment in wealthy households. Musical instruments, often rare or finely crafted, reflected status. Poetry, storytelling, and games like chess were common leisure activities. Artistic patronage. Wealthy individuals commissioned private artworks, paintings, tapestries, or carvings, both for personal pleasure and prestige. Religious icons and illuminated manuscripts often doubled as both devotion and display of cultural sophistication. Gardens and outdoor spaces. Formal gardens were designed for contemplation, exercise, and aesthetic enjoyment. Exotic plants, fountains, and geometrical layouts showcased knowledge, taste, and resources. Gardens also served as venues for small gatherings, music, or al fresco dining.
Intellectual pursuits. Reading and writing were valued among the elite, with private libraries storing rare manuscripts. Astrology, philosophy, and science fascinated many, allowing for private study and experimentation. Wealth enabled travel for cultural and intellectual enrichment, including pilgrimages or educational visits. Luxury indulgences. Bathing and personal hygiene, often rare for the general populace, were important rituals for the wealthy. Perfumes, oils, and fine textiles enhanced personal comfort and displayed status. Exotic foods, imported goods, and rare spices offered sensory pleasures inaccessible to most. Privacy and discretion. Private quarters allowed millionaires to retreat from social obligations and enjoy indulgences without scrutiny. Servants, attendants, and advisors ensured both convenience and security, maintaining a life of comfort behind closed doors. Through private entertainment and indulgences, medieval millionaires cultivated not only pleasure but influence, taste, and social dominance. Their leisure activities reflected a carefully curated life designed for both personal enjoyment and public admiration. Financial management, investments, and trade in medieval millionaires' private life. Wealth in the medieval era was both a source of power and a responsibility. For millionaires of the time, managing money, property, and trade required foresight, strategy, and connections. Their private life often revolved around securing, growing, and protecting assets. Land ownership and agriculture. Land was the primary source of wealth. Owning extensive estates allowed for agricultural production, rents, and labor exploitation. Millionaires managed crops, livestock, and tenant farmers to maximize income. They often invested in land improvements like irrigation, mills, and storage facilities to increase productivity.
Wealthy individuals engaged in trade, both local and international, dealing in luxury goods like spices, silk, wine, and precious metals. Merchant networks and guild connections ensured steady supply and market advantage. Private agreements, often sealed with contracts, enabled control over profits and minimized risks. Loans and credit systems. Lending money was a common investment, often secured against land or goods. Interest and repayment terms were carefully calculated, sometimes enforced by legal or social pressure. Managing debt and credit allowed millionaires to exert influence over smaller landowners or merchants. Investment in crafts and workshops. Wealth was channeled into workshops producing textiles, metalwork, or fine goods. Master craftsmen were employed to maintain quality, prestige, and market appeal. Investments could also include specialized workshops for luxury goods like silks, perfumes, or weapons. Investments could also include specialized workshops for luxury goods like silk as a weapon. In this world, secrecy was more than comfort, it was survival. The millionaire's life intertwined luxury with vigilance. Invitations had to be carefully extended, gossip carefully ignored, and alliances constantly nurtured. Even family could be dangerous. Marriages arranged for wealth sometimes concealed ulterior motives. Children were educated not only in letters and faith, but in the subtle art of negotiation and self-preservation. A single mistake could unravel a carefully curated image of power. The contrast of public and private. This duality, public display versus private indulgence, defined the medieval millionaire. While the outside world saw power, luxury, and sophistication, the private world contained whispered desires, secret schemes, and personal joys.
Every feast, every chamber, every library, every hidden garden was a piece of a delicate puzzle, projecting strength, nurturing influence, and securing legacy, all while indulging in the privileges that wealth uniquely afforded. This glimpse reveals that medieval wealth was never just about material comfort. It was an intricate dance of influence, secrecy, and pleasure, where every decision could elevate or endanger a fortune. Luxurious daily routines. A medieval millionaire's day was a study in opulence and ritual. Morning began in a chamber decorated with tapestries, rare rugs, and carved furniture imported from distant lands. Servants attended to every need, bathing with scented oils, dressing in garments of silk, velvet, or finely embroidered wool, and preparing a breakfast of fresh bread, cheese, and honeyed wine. Business affairs were conducted in private halls or libraries, with ledgers, coin, and contracts meticulously maintained. Merchants, scribes, and envoys came and went, negotiating trades, loans, and alliances. Despite the luxury, life demanded vigilance. Rivals and competitors could manipulate markets, demand bribes, or even orchestrate thefts of prized goods. Meals were events in themselves, often lasting hours, with exotic foods from distant lands, spiced meats, preserved fruits, and imported wine. Guests were entertained with music, storytelling, or performances by traveling minstrels. Even in these moments of leisure, the millionaire's household remained a theater of power, hierarchy, and display.
Private gardens and leisure indulgences. A medieval millionaire's estate extended beyond walls and halls into meticulously designed gardens and hunting grounds. These gardens were symbols of wealth, taste, and control over nature. Walled enclaves filled with rare herbs, fragrant flowers, fruit trees, and carefully trimmed hedges. Some even had fountains, ponds, or exotic plants brought from distant lands, signaling the owner's far-reaching influence and connections. Hunting was both leisure and status. Wealthy nobles and merchants maintained large estates where they hunted deer, boar, or game birds. Hunts were elaborate affairs, involving trained dogs, falconers, and retinues of servants. They were not merely sport. They demonstrated skill, courage, and the ability to command resources. Guests would often participate, enjoying feasts afterward in temporary pavilions erected for such occasions. Entertainment within private estates included music, poetry, and games. Minstrels, troubadours, and performers were invited to display their talents, sometimes teaching exotic dances or performing stories from far-off lands. Wealthy households often maintained libraries or scriptoria, collecting manuscripts, illuminated texts, and documents that symbolized knowledge and cultural refinement. Luxury did not exempt the millionaire from practical concerns. Estate management required oversight of workers, tenants, and trade, ensuring crops, livestock, and property remained productive and profitable. Security was constant, with walls, guards, and sometimes moats protecting both material wealth and reputation.
Private chambers and sleeping arrangements. Inside a medieval millionaire's mansion, private chambers reflected both comfort and status. The main bedchamber often featured a large canopied bed draped with heavy curtains for warmth and privacy. Mattresses were stuffed with feathers or straw, and bedding was layered with fine linens, wool, or even silk for the wealthiest households. Beds were not merely for sleep. They were social spaces where important conversations, negotiations, and displays of status took place. Chambers were furnished with tapestries, carpets, and rugs, which added insulation against cold stone walls, while also showcasing intricate designs, heraldic symbols, or scenes from religious or secular life. Windows were often glazed with small pieces of colored glass, allowing light while maintaining privacy. Candles, torches, and braziers provided warmth and illumination, with careful placement to avoid fire hazards. Apart from the main bedchamber, there were dressing rooms, private studies, and sometimes libraries or small chapels. Dressing involved elaborate garments made of wool, linen, and occasionally imported silks, adorned with embroidery, fur trims, and jewelry. Personal grooming was meticulous. Hair care, bathing when possible, and skincare routines were maintained, often with imported oils, herbs, and perfumes. The intimate life of a medieval millionaire was both private and strategic. Marriages and relationships were often arranged for political or economic advantage, but within these constraints, personal comfort and pleasure were highly valued. Private quarters allowed discretion, whether for family life, romantic relationships, or confidential discussions with trusted companions. Meals, feasts, and culinary indulgences. A medieval millionaire's diet was a vivid display of wealth, status, and access to resources. Meals were not only about sustenance, they were statements of prestige, with ingredients, presentation, and rituals reflecting social hierarchy. The wealthy enjoyed multiple daily meals, often starting with a light breakfast of bread, cheese, and ale, followed by a mid-morning snack or repast. Lunch and dinner were grand affairs. Tables were laden with a variety of meats, beef, lamb, pork, game like venison or boar, and poultry such as swan, peacock, or goose. Fish, both freshwater and saltwater, featured prominently, especially on fasting days dictated by religious customs. Exotic spices like saffron, cinnamon, pepper, and nutmeg were highly prized, often imported from distant lands, symbolizing both wealth and global connections. Vegetables and legumes were also served, though often considered secondary to meat.
Fruits, both fresh and preserved, added color, flavor, and nutrition. Bread was a staple, with white bread reserved for the wealthy, while coarser grains served the lower classes. Sauces were complex, blending herbs, spices, wine, and vinegar to elevate flavors. Feasts were lavish spectacles. Servants and cooks orchestrated the preparation and presentation, often in public halls, adorned with tapestries and banners. Courses were served in succession, and table manners were highly ritualized, demonstrating refinement and education. Entertainment, minstrels, jugglers, and dancers often accompanied meals, turning dining into a multi-sensory event. Wine and ale flowed freely. Wealthy households imported wines from France, Spain, or Germany, while ale and mead were produced locally. Drinking vessels were often made of silver, gold, or fine ceramics, reflecting the host's affluence.
Leisure activities, hobbies, and entertainment. For a medieval millionaire, life was not only about work and wealth accumulation. Leisure played a critical role in asserting social status and cultivating influence. Leisure activities ranged from intellectual pursuits to physical sports, each reflecting sophistication, skill, and refinement. Hunting and falconry. Hunting was both a sport and a display of status. Expansive private lands allowed the wealthy to hunt deer, boar, and wild birds. Falconry, using trained hawks and falcons, was an aristocratic pastime, requiring patience, skill, and expensive equipment. Hunts were social events, often accompanied by elaborate meals and gatherings. Music and performing arts. Wealthy households supported musicians, minstrels, and performers. Private concerts allowed owners to showcase cultural taste, while providing entertainment during feasts or intimate gatherings. Musical instruments ranged from lutes and harps to flutes and drums. Poetry and storytelling were equally prized, with tales of chivalry, romance, and heroism recited by skilled performers. Board games and intellectual games. Chess, dice games, and other strategy games were popular among the elite, fostering both entertainment and mental challenge. Owning rare, handcrafted game sets was a mark of sophistication. Wealthy patrons sometimes sponsored tournaments or competitions, blending recreation with social networking.
Personal servants, household management, and domestic life. A medieval millionaire's life was impossible without a structured household and dedicated servants. The private life of the wealthy revolved around comfort, convenience, and social presentation, all carefully managed through a hierarchy of staff and meticulously maintained spaces. Household staff. A millionaire's household would include a wide range of servants, each with specialized roles. Stewards and chamberlains managed finances, daily schedules, and the household's overall functioning. Cooks and kitchen staff prepared lavish meals, often reflecting seasonal availability and imported delicacies. Recipes were closely guarded family secrets. Maids and valets attended to clothing, grooming, and personal needs, ensuring that the owner was always presented elegantly. Guards and watchmen ensured security both from thieves and from political rivals. Some households maintained armed retainers or private guards.
Specialists, artists, musicians, tutors, and craftsmen might be retained for entertainment, education, or luxury production. Daily routine. Life was highly structured. Mornings might begin with prayers, grooming, and consultation with stewards. Meals were social events, often including discussions of politics, business, and social alliances. Afternoons could involve hunting.
reading, or entertaining guests, while evenings were reserved for music, storytelling, or private reflection. Private spaces. Wealthy homes were divided into private and public spaces. Great halls for hosting feasts, ceremonies, and meetings with other elites. Bedchambers, luxurious, warm, and often decorated with tapestries, furs, and rich fabrics. Gardens and courtyards were used for leisure, reflection, and private strolls. Libraries or studies contained manuscripts, books, and instruments for intellectual pursuits. Food and drink. Meals were abundant and often extravagant, emphasizing imported spices, wines, and delicacies unavailable to commoners. Tableware and presentation were indicators of wealth, with silver, gold, and fine ceramics used for display. Clothing, fashion, and personal appearance. For a medieval millionaire, clothing was far more than a necessity. It was a symbol of wealth, status, and taste. Every thread, fabric, and accessory reflected social rank, connections, and even political alignment. Materials and fabrics. Silks and velvets imported from distant lands like Byzantium and the Far East. These fabrics were soft, luxurious, and highly prized. Furs, minks, sables, and foxes lined cloaks and hoods for warmth and prestige. Wool and linen. While common among peasants, wealthy individuals used the finest wool and linen, often dyed in vibrant, expensive colors. Colors and dyes. Certain colors, like deep purples or rich reds, were associated with nobility and power due to the high cost of dyes. Bright colors signaled wealth and distinguished the wearer from the dull-toned clothing of the lower classes. Accessories and jewelry. Belts, brooches, and rings, often made of gold or silver, sometimes embedded with precious stones. Headdresses and hats, worn according to gender, status, and occasion, from simple circlets to elaborate veils and feathered caps. Shoes. Fine leather boots or pointed shoes signaled status, often ornamented with embroidery or metallic accents.
Grooming and personal care. Wealthy men and women paid great attention to hygiene, hair, and skin care, using scented oils, combs, and mirrors. Perfumes, oils, and ointments were common among the elite, distinguishing them from commoners whose daily routines were limited to basic washing. Social significance. Clothing reinforced social hierarchies. Expensive, decorated garments indicated power, alliances, and cultural sophistication. Fashion trends traveled slowly, with wealthy households often employing personal tailors to create unique pieces. Private display versus public presence. Certain garments were reserved for private enjoyment or intimate gatherings. Public attire was chosen to impress visitors, neighbors, and potential political allies.
Daily routines, servants, and household management. A medieval millionaire's life depended heavily on organization, discipline, and the work of numerous household staff. The smooth functioning of such an estate required careful planning and delegation. Morning rituals. The day often began at dawn with personal grooming, prayer, and a light breakfast. Wealthy individuals might have attendants to assist with bathing, dressing in fine garments, and preparing for the day. Servants and household staff.
A large staff managed every aspect of daily life: cooks, cleaners, stable hands, guards, and personal attendants. Some households even had specialized roles like a master of the wine cellar or a keeper of exotic animals. Trusted advisors and stewards managed finances, property, and legal matters, allowing the millionaire to focus on social, political, and personal pursuits. Household operations. Kitchens were bustling centers with multiple servants preparing meals for both the family and guests. Maintenance of the estate included cleaning, repairing, and decorating, often guided by the master or mistress of the house. Security was vital. Guards patrolled the property, especially at night, protecting treasures, livestock, and family members. Leisure and work balance.
While wealth allowed freedom from manual labor, the day was structured with a balance of leisure, social obligations, and personal interests. Meetings with business partners, local officials, or visiting nobles were common, often accompanied by entertainment and fine dining. Evening routines. Evenings were often reserved for private reflection, reading, or entertainment in more intimate settings. Feasts, musical performances, or storytelling might take place in the grand hall, providing both amusement and status display. Nighttime security ensured safety, while personal attendants prepared the bedroom with clean linens, warm coverings, and candles or braziers for comfort. This system of structured routines and staff management allowed the millionaire to live a life of comfort, influence, and indulgence, far removed from the hardships of ordinary people. Fashion, personal appearance, and symbolism in clothing. For a medieval millionaire, clothing was not just about protection from the elements. It was a statement of wealth, power, and social status. Every garment, accessory, and color had meaning, and appearances were carefully curated to reflect prestige. Clothing materials and styles. Wealthy individuals favored luxury fabrics like silk, velvet, and fine wool. Garments were often layered, with tunics, surcoats, and cloaks, each embroidered or adorned with trims.
Brightly colored clothing, dyed using rare and expensive materials like woad or madder, was a visible sign of wealth. Symbolic accessories. Jewelry was abundant: rings, brooches, and necklaces crafted from gold, silver, and gemstones. Belts, gloves, and hats were carefully chosen to complement outfits and convey status. Even footwear, often elaborately decorated, signified rank and taste. Hairstyles and grooming. Grooming was meticulous. Clean hair, trimmed beards, and manicured nails demonstrated refinement. Both men and women used combs, oils, and sometimes perfumed powders to maintain appearance. Hairstyles could indicate marital status, age, or social rank, with intricate braids and adornments for women. Color and heraldry. Colors were not arbitrary. Deep blues, purples, and reds were especially valued. Family crests, embroidered on garments or displayed on shields and banners, communicated lineage and alliances. Fashion was a language. It broadcasted power, taste, and social connections at a glance. Occasions and attire. Daily wear was elegant but practical. Extravagant outfits were reserved for feasts, ceremonies, or court appearances. Certain fabrics or decorations were restricted by sumptuary laws, ensuring that only the wealthy could display particular luxuries. Even sleepwear and undergarments were carefully made, emphasizing comfort and subtle elegance. This meticulous attention to clothing and personal appearance reinforced the millionaire's influence and prestige in society, shaping both perception and interactions with peers. Entertainment, hobbies, and leisure activities of medieval millionaires. Life for a wealthy individual in the medieval era was not only about wealth accumulation, but also about cultivating refined tastes and enjoying exclusive pastimes. Leisure was a key marker of social status, and activities were carefully chosen to impress peers and solidify influence. Feasts and banquets were grand feasts, often lasting for hours with multiple courses. Exotic ingredients, rare spices, and elaborate dishes like silks, perfumes, or weapons. Financial advisors and stewardship. Trusted stewards, accountants, and advisors managed estates, trade deals, and taxes. Detailed records, including ledgers and inventories, were kept to monitor finances. These private arrangements ensured wealth was not only maintained, but strategically expanded. Taxation and political leverage.
Wealthy landowners paid taxes and levies to kings or lords, but often negotiated reductions. Political influence was reinforced through donations, patronage, or strategic marriages. Financial clout enabled participation in local councils or advisory positions to further protect interests. Luxury consumption as investment. Expenditure on art, jewelry, and fine goods was not only personal pleasure, but also a form of investment and social signaling. Rare items could appreciate in value, and displaying wealth reinforced social dominance. Inheritance and succession planning. Ensuring wealth passed to heirs was crucial. Detailed wills and legal arrangements prevented disputes. Marriage alliances were often strategic, combining wealth, influence, and estates. Through meticulous financial management, strategic trade, and careful investment, medieval millionaires secured not only comfort, but long-term influence. Their private life intertwined personal luxury with economic foresight, ensuring that wealth was both enjoyed and preserved across generations.